June 26, 1977. Graceland, Memphis. 2:34 a.m. In the jungle room of his estate, Elvis Presley sat alone with a reel-to-reel tape recorder 6 weeks before his death. What he recorded that night wasn't a song. It was a confession. For 23 years, Elvis had kept a secret that ate at him every single day. A secret about the man who controlled his career, his finances, and ultimately, his life. That man was Colonel Tom Parker, and what Elvis revealed on that tape would explain everything. Why the king of rock and roll never toured internationally, why he was performing in Vegas when he should have been conquering the world, and why he died essentially bankrupt despite earning over $1 billion in his lifetime. The tape was discovered in 1980 during the estate's legal battle with Parker. Elvis's voice, slurred but determined, spoke for 47 minutes about a truth he'd discovered in 1968, but had been too afraid to expose while he was alive. "I want Priscilla to know," he said on the recording. "I want Lisa Marie to understand why her daddy couldn't leave, why I stayed in this cage, even when I knew the bars were killing me. The Colonel wasn't who he said he was, and once I found out the truth, he owned me in ways I can't even explain." This isn't the story of a star who lost control. This is the story of a man who never had control in the first place, trapped by a secret so explosive that it cost him his freedom, his dignity, and ultimately his life. This is the confession Colonel Tom Parker spent 40 years trying to bury. To understand the cage Elvis lived in, you must first understand how he got trapped inside it. Born Elvis Aaron Presley on January 8, 1935, in Tupelo, Mississippi, he grew up in poverty so complete that his family often went without electricity. His twin brother Jesse Garon was stillborn, leaving Elvis with a lifelong sense of incompleteness, as if half of himself had been taken before he even had a chance to know it. Music was his escape. Gospel in church, blues on Beale Street, country on the radio. By 1954, at age 19, he walked into Sun Records and recorded "That's All Right." And everything changed. His fusion of black rhythm and blues with white country music created something the world had never heard before. Within a year, he was causing riots. Within 2 years, he was the biggest star in America. That's when Colonel Tom Parker appeared. A carnival promoter and talent manager with a reputation for making stars, Parker saw in Elvis not an artist, but a gold mine. In 1956, he convinced Elvis's parents, simple, trusting people who were terrified of losing their newfound security, to sign a management contract giving Parker control over Elvis's career. The terms were extraordinary. Parker would receive 50% of everything Elvis earned. An arrangement virtually unheard of in the industry, where managers typically took 10 to 15%. "My daddy didn't understand contracts," Elvis said on the tape. "He just saw a man in a fancy suit telling him his son was going to be rich. We were so poor, so scared of going back to poverty, that we signed anything put in front of us. We gave the Colonel everything, and he took it." For the first decade, the arrangement seemed to work. Elvis became the king. Movies, records, television appearances, sold-out concerts. Parker negotiated deal after deal, and the money poured in. But there were strange limitations. Elvis never toured outside North America. When international promoters offered millions for European or Asian tours, Parker always declined. When the Beatles dominated England and wanted Elvis to reciprocate with a UK tour, Parker said no. Elvis begged. Parker refused. "I thought it was strategy," Elvis said. "The Colonel told me we didn't need foreign markets, that we were making enough in America. But that wasn't the reason. The reason was a secret he'd kept from everyone, including me, for over 20 years. Stop here. What comes next changes everything. The discovery that changed everything. 1968. The '68 comeback special. It was supposed to be Elvis's triumphant return after years of mediocre movies. The special was a massive success, reminding the world why Elvis was the king. But behind the scenes, Elvis was starting to ask questions, specifically about money and contracts that didn't make sense. According to the tape and later confirmed by estate accountants, Elvis was earning astronomical sums, but somehow always seemed to be in financial distress. Parker explained this away, with vague references to taxes and overhead costs. But Elvis's father, Vernon, who handled day-to-day finances, started noticing discrepancies. Money that should have been in Elvis's accounts was missing. Contracts had terms Elvis didn't remember agreeing to. In late 1968, Vernon hired a private investigator, not to investigate Parker's financial dealings initially, but to locate a contract Elvis thought had been lost. What the investigator discovered instead would explain everything. Colonel Tom Parker wasn't Colonel Tom Parker at all. He was Andreas Cornelis van Kook, an illegal immigrant from the Netherlands who had entered the United States in 1929 and never obtained citizenship. More damning, there were questions about his departure from Holland. Dutch records, which the investigator accessed through contacts in Amsterdam, suggested Van Kook may have fled the country to avoid questioning in connection with a woman's death in Breda in 1929. Whether he was directly involved or simply feared being implicated is unclear. But the investigation revealed he left Holland suddenly and never returned, never contacted his family again, and constructed an entirely new identity in America. "The colonel wasn't a colonel," Elvis said on the tape, his voice a mixture of betrayal and resignation. "He wasn't even American. He was an illegal immigrant who was terrified of being discovered. And once I knew that, once I understood why he could never let me tour internationally, because he had no passport, because he couldn't risk any scrutiny of his identity, I also understood that I was trapped, because if I exposed him, he'd take everything, and he had the contracts to do it. But the most shocking moment was still ahead. The trap closes. 1969 to 1977. After discovering Parker's secret, Elvis faced an impossible choice. He could expose Parker and free himself from the predatory management contract. But Parker controlled the rights to Elvis's name and image through a web of corporations. Parker had negotiated deals where he, not Elvis, owned the merchandising, the licensing, the back catalog. If Elvis tried to break free, Parker could tie him up in litigation for years and cut off his income entirely. More importantly, Parker knew Elvis's weaknesses. By 1969, Elvis was already struggling with prescription drug dependency, a habit that had started innocently with Army-prescribed amphetamines in the late 1950s, but had gradually spiraled. Parker, rather than helping Elvis get treatment, enabled the addiction because a dependent Elvis was a controllable Elvis. "He kept me working when I should have been in rehab," Elvis said on the tape. "He kept booking shows in Vegas because he could control that environment. He could control who I saw, what I did, how much I was using. And I knew he was doing it deliberately. Keeping me sick because sick Elvis couldn't leave him." The Vegas years, 1969 to 1976, were a gilded cage. Elvis performed over 600 shows at the International Hotel, later the Hilton. On paper, the contracts were worth millions. But the structure of the deals, negotiated by Parker, meant that a huge percentage went to Parker's management fees, to promotional companies Parker secretly owned, to expenses that were inflated beyond reason. According to documents uncovered during the estate's lawsuit against Parker in the 1980s, Elvis was earning approximately $5 million per year in Vegas alone during his peak years there. But after Parker's 50% management fee, after the expenses Parker authorized, after the payments to various Parker-controlled entities, Elvis was netting less than $1 million annually, and spending far more than that to maintain Graceland, support his entourage, and fund his pharmaceutical habit. "I was making millions and going broke at the same time," Elvis said. "And I couldn't say anything because Parker had the contracts, had the lawyers, had everything. He'd built this system where I was the talent, but he owned the business. And because I knew his secret, because I could destroy him by revealing he was an illegal immigrant who'd been lying for 40 years, he made damn sure I knew that exposing him would mean exposing myself. He had files on my drug use, on every prescription, every doctor I'd bribed. We were locked together, prisoner and warden, at the same time." And this is the part the studios never wanted revealed, the industry's silent complicity. What makes the Elvis-Parker relationship particularly disturbing is that many people in the music industry knew or suspected Parker's true identity, and no one intervened. RCA Records executives knew Parker's refusal to let Elvis tour internationally was costing them millions in potential revenue. But they didn't question it. Hollywood studios knew Parker's contract terms were exploitative, but they worked with him anyway because Elvis was profitable. Jerry Weintraub, who managed Elvis's tours in the 1970s, later admitted in his autobiography, "We all knew something was off about the Colonel. The way he controlled Elvis, the way he structured the deals, it wasn't normal. But Elvis was printing money, and in this business, you don't ask questions when the cash register is ringing." The Vegas hotels benefited enormously from Elvis's residencies. His shows guaranteed full capacity, not just in the showroom, but throughout the hotel, restaurants, casinos, rooms. Elvis was estimated to generate over $100 million annually in total economic impact for the Hilton during his residency years. Hotel executives knew Parker was taking an obscene percentage, but they didn't care, because they were making fortunes. Even Elvis's personal physician, Dr. George Nicopolis, later admitted he knew Elvis was being exploited, but felt powerless to intervene. The Colonel had complete control, Nicopolis testified during his medical board hearing in 1980. Elvis would beg for time off, for rest, for help with his addiction, but the Colonel kept the schedule full, kept the pressure constant, and when Elvis couldn't perform, I was expected to give him whatever drugs would get him back on stage. I was part of the system that killed him. The system worked because everyone was making money except Elvis. And the person who knew the most, Elvis himself, couldn't speak, because speaking meant mutually assured destruction. Parker would lose his identity and likely face deportation. Elvis would lose his income, his image, and potentially his freedom if Parker's files on his drug use were made public. The financial devastation. When Elvis died on August 16, 1977, at age 42, the public assumed he was leaving behind a massive fortune. After all, he'd earned over $1 billion in his lifetime, one of the highest-earning entertainers in history. But the reality, revealed during the estate's probate, was shocking. Elvis's estate was worth approximately $5 million and had debts of nearly $3 million. He died essentially bankrupt. Where did the money go? Forensic accountants hired by Priscilla Presley and the estate traced the flow and discovered a systematic siphoning that had been occurring for over 20 years. Parker's 50% management fee was just the beginning. He had set up multiple corporate entities, merchandising companies, promotional firms, licensing corporations that he controlled but that processed Elvis's earnings, taking additional cuts at each level. One particularly egregious example. In 1973, Parker negotiated a deal selling RCA the rights to Elvis's entire back catalog for $5.4 million. On paper, this was split between Parker and Elvis per their contract, but the estate's attorneys discovered that Parker had negotiated separate consulting fees for himself as part of the deal, effectively taking 75% of the total rather than the contractual 50%. Elvis likely didn't even understand the deal's structure when he signed it. Even more damning, after Elvis's death, Parker continued to try to control the estate. He negotiated deals on behalf of the estate that would have given him ongoing percentages of Elvis's posthumous earnings. It was only when Priscilla hired new attorneys and they began investigating Parker's background that the full truth emerged. The estate sued Parker in 1982, and the settlement, along with the documentation that emerged during discovery, finally revealed what Elvis had known since 1968, but had been too trapped to expose. Parker had systematically exploited Elvis for over 20 years, using Elvis's trust, his financial desperation, and ultimately his fear of exposure to maintain control long past the point where Elvis should have been able to break free. The tape in the Jungle Room, June 26, 1977, 6 weeks before his death. Elvis knew his health was failing. The drugs that were supposed to help him sleep, help him perform, help him cope had instead destroyed his body. He was 42, but looked 20 years older. He knew he was dying. That night, alone, in Graceland's Jungle Room, he recorded his confession. The tape, which runs 47 minutes, contains Elvis's account of his discovery of Parker's identity, his realization that he was trapped, his attempts to negotiate freedom, and Parker's implicit threats about what would happen if Elvis ever spoke publicly. "I want people to know I wasn't stupid," Elvis says on the tape, his voice thick with emotion and medication. I knew what was happening. I knew he was stealing from me. But I also knew that if I fought back, he could destroy me. He could leak my prescription records. He could testify about my drug use. He could make sure I never worked again. And I couldn't let that happen because I had Priscilla. I had Lisa Marie. I had 100 people on my payroll who depended on me. So I stayed in the cage. I kept performing. I kept making him rich. And I died inside a little more every day. He pauses on the tape and there's the sound of ice in a glass. Then, the worst part is that I could have been so much more. I could have toured the world. I could have performed with the Beatles in London, recorded in Abbey Road, done concerts in Paris and Tokyo and Sydney. I wanted that so badly. But the Colonel couldn't let it happen because he couldn't leave the country. And I couldn't expose him because he'd made sure I had just as much to lose as he did. So instead, I did Vegas shows for tourists, made mediocre movies for a paycheck, and watched my life disappear into his pockets. The tape ends with Elvis speaking directly to Lisa Marie, who was 9 years old at the time. Baby, when you're old enough to understand this, I want you to know that Daddy loved you more than anything in the world. And if I couldn't give you everything I wanted to give you, if I couldn't be the man I wanted to be for you, it's because I was trapped by my own choices and someone else's lies. Don't make the same mistakes. Don't let anyone own you. Don't sign anything without understanding what you're signing. And remember that money isn't freedom. Sometimes money is just a different kind of prison. Elvis died 6 weeks after recording that tape, found unresponsive in his Graceland bathroom. The official cause was cardiac arrhythmia, but the autopsy revealed 14 different drugs in his system. His personal physician was later charged with overprescribing, but the system that enabled that overprescription, the Colonel's insistence on constant performances, the industry's willingness to look the other way as long as the money kept flowing, was never held accountable. The story of Elvis Presley and Colonel Tom Parker is not just a story about a corrupt manager. It's a story about how the entertainment industry enables exploitation when it's profitable. It's about how power imbalances can trap even the most famous people in the world. It's about how secrets, both Parker's hidden identity and Elvis's drug dependency, can become weapons of control. Elvis earned over $1 billion in his lifetime and died with less than $5 million. He was the king of rock and roll, beloved by millions, and he died alone on a bathroom floor at age 42, poisoned by drugs that were supposed to keep him performing. He wanted to tour the world and was confined to Vegas because his manager couldn't risk international travel. The tape from the Jungle Room, finally made public during the estate's litigation, reveals a man who understood exactly what was happening to him, but felt powerless to stop it. It's not the recording of someone who was naive or weak. It's the testimony of someone who was systematically trapped and exploited, who made the calculation that exposure would hurt his family more than silence would hurt himself. I don't want sympathy, Elvis says near the end of the tape. I made my choices. I signed the contracts. I took the pills. But I want people to understand that sometimes the prison doesn't have bars you can see. Sometimes it's just a contract you signed when you were 21 and didn't understand. Sometimes it's a secret someone holds over you. Sometimes it's the knowledge that fighting back will hurt the people you love more than it will free you. He takes a breath, audible on the recording. The Colonel won. He beat me. But maybe, if this tape ever gets heard, maybe it helps the next kid from Mississippi who gets offered a contract from a man in a fancy suit. Maybe it helps someone understand that you can be the king and still be a prisoner. Maybe that's worth something. Today, we understand that Elvis Presley's tragedy wasn't about rock and roll excess or the price of fame. It was about systematic exploitation enabled by an industry that valued profit over people. Colonel Tom Parker died in 1997, never having faced criminal charges for his financial manipulation of Elvis, never having been held accountable for the decades of exploitation. But Elvis's tape remains, a 47-minute confession from a dying man trying to explain how the king of rock and roll became a prisoner in his own life. And in that confession, we hear not weakness, but a brutal kind of clarity. the understanding that sometimes the truth costs more than silence, and that sometimes survival means staying in a cage even when you've found the key.